In 1177 BCE, within the span of a single generation, every major Bronze Age civilization on Earth collapsed simultaneously. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Ugaritians, the Egyptians nearly. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned, burned, or simply emptied. Palace economies that coordinated thousands of people across hundreds of miles went silent. Archaeologists have been arguing about why for 150 years. They still don't agree. What they do agree on is this: it happened fast. Faster than any model of civilizational collapse predicted was possible. Alright, let's go. Number 10. Cahokia. In 1811, Henry Marie Brackenridge, a lawyer traveling through the American Midwest, stood at the base of a flat-topped earthen mound rising 30 meters above the Mississippi floodplain in present-day Illinois, and wrote that it was as large as the base of the Pyramid of Giza. He was not exaggerating. Monk's Mound, the central structure of the city now known as Cahokia, covers 5.7 hectares at its base, making it larger by footprint than any structure in ancient Egypt. It was built entirely by hand, without the wheel, without draft animals, without metal tools between approximately 900 and 1100 CE. The city around it was the largest urban settlement in North America north of Mexico. At its peak around 1050 CE, Cahokia covered an estimated 16 square kilometers and housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people, more than the population of London at the same date. It contained more than 120 earthen mounds arranged in a grid pattern aligned to the solstices, a large central plaza, and evidence of a sophisticated political and ceremonial hierarchy, coordinating labor across a regional population stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Timothy Pocketat of the University of Illinois, in his 2004 study Ancient Cahokia and the Mississippians, documented what happened next. By 1200 CE, the population was declining. By 1350 CE, the city was empty. No European had arrived. No conquest occurred. The people of Cahokia simply left over the course of roughly 150 years, and nobody recorded where they went or why. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The two most commonly cited causes, prolonged drought and agricultural collapse, are supported by proxy data from tree rings and flood deposits. What they don't explain is the Palisade Wall. At some point in the 13th century, the people of Cahokia built a 2-kilometer wooden stockade around the central precinct containing Monk's Mound. They rebuilt it at least 3 times. Something made 20,000 people feel they needed a fortified wall around their largest monument. The archaeology doesn't tell us what. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what Cahokia built, it's what Cahokia represents. The largest city in pre-Columbian North America, home to a civilization with enough organizational sophistication to align 120 earthen mounds to celestial events, left no written record of its own existence. Its builders had no name for themselves that we have recovered. When Europeans arrived in the region in the 17th century and asked the local tribes about the mounds, the tribe said they didn't build them. The Mississippian culture that produced Cahokia had dissolved so completely that its own neighbors, a few generations later, had no memory of it. The city that rivaled medieval London in population is now a state historic site in Illinois, surrounded by suburban sprawl next to a casino. Most people who drive past it on Interstate 255 have never heard its name. Number 9. The Minoan Civilization. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavating the island of Santorini, ancient Thera, and found a Bronze Age city buried under 30 meters of volcanic ash. Akrotiri was a Minoan trading port preserved in extraordinary detail. Multi-story buildings with running water and drain systems, storerooms still stacked with ceramic jars, frescoes depicting leaping dolphins and boxing children, streets paved with flat stones. Not a single human body was found. The population had evacuated before the eruption. They had known it was coming. The eruption that buried Akrotiri occurred around 1600 BCE. It was one of the largest volcanic events of the past 10,000 years. A VTI 6-7 event that expelled an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of magma, generated tsunamis reaching 35 meters in height on the northern coast of Crete, and injected enough sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to cause measurable climate disruption across the northern hemisphere. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica record the event. The environmental signature is unmistakable. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete, 110 kilometers south of Thera, did not collapse in 1600 BCE. It survived. The palace at Knossos continued operating. The palace at Phaistos continued operating. The Linear A administrative system continued producing records. The Minoans adapted. They rebuilt. The Minoan civilization collapsed in approximately 1450 BCE, 150 years after the eruption. What destroyed it is not agreed upon. The palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, Malaya, and Zakros were all violently destroyed within a short period around 1450 BCE. Only Knossos shows signs of subsequent reoccupation by Mycenaean Greeks who appear to have taken it over. The other palace centers were abandoned permanently. Linear A, the writing system of the Minoans, vanished with them. It has never been deciphered. Not a single Minoan text has been read. Consider the implication. A civilization sophisticated enough to build multi-story palaces with indoor plumbing, to administer a maritime trading empire stretching from Egypt to mainland Greece, to create one of the ancient world's most distinctive art traditions, survived a catastrophic volcanic eruption that produced 35-meter tsunamis on their home island. And then, 150 years later, they were gone. Whatever destroyed the Minoans was not the volcano. It arrived after the volcano. It was something the Minoans, having already survived the worst natural disaster of their era, were not prepared for. Linear A still cannot be read. Whatever the Minoans were saying to each other in the years before 1450 BCE has not reached us. Number 8. The Tiwanaku Empire. In 1549, Spanish conquistador Pedro Chiesa de Leon arrived at the ruins of Tiwanaku on the Bolivian Altiplano at 3,800 meters above sea level on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca. He found massive stone structures, the Acapana Pyramid, the Kalasasaya Temple Complex, the Gateway of the Sun, built from sandstone and andesite blocks weighing up to 130 tons, transported from quarries across the lake. He asked the Inca, then the dominant civilization of the Andes, who had built Tiwanaku. The Inca said, "We don't know. It was before us." The Tiwanaku civilization flourished between approximately 300 and 1000 CE, centered on the Lake Titicaca Basin in modern Bolivia and Peru. At its peak, the capital city held an estimated 10,000 to 60,000 people. Estimates vary widely because the site has never been fully excavated. The empire controlled territory from southern Peru to northern Chile and Argentina, an area approximately the size of France. It was the dominant Andean civilization for 700 years. What made Tiwanaku exceptional was its agricultural system. The Altiplano at 3,800 meters is cold, dry, and subject to killing frosts. Paleoclimatologist Lonnie Thompson of Ohio State University, in research published in Science in 1994, reconstructed the climate history of the Andes from ice cores drilled at Huascarán in Peru. The cores show that Tiwanaku existed through one of the most prolonged droughts in Andean history, a 500-year dry period beginning around 500 CE. Tiwanaku's response was to build suca colas, raised field agriculture, earthen platforms surrounded by canals that retained solar heat and prevented frost damage. The system was so effective that modern agricultural agencies have attempted to revive it in Bolivia. To put this in perspective, Tiwanaku engineered a solution to a 500-year drought at 3,800 meters, without iron tools, without the wheel. The solution worked for 500 years, but here's where the standard explanation becomes genuinely disturbing. Around 1000 CE, the drought ended. Rainfall returned to the Altiplano. The raised field system, designed for drought conditions, should have been even more productive under normal rainfall. Instead, within a single generation, roughly 25 to 30 years, the Tiwanaku Empire collapsed. The capital was abandoned. The raised fields were never used again. Alan Collada of the University of Chicago, who has studied Tiwanaku for 3 decades, proposed in 1993 that the returning rains produced flooding that overwhelmed the raised field system, destroying agricultural infrastructure rather than reviving it. The data supports this partially. What it doesn't explain is the speed. Civilizations that survive 500-year droughts don't typically collapse in 30 years when the rain comes back. Whatever killed Tiwanaku, it killed it fast. A civilization that had engineered its way through the worst climate stress in Andean history was gone within a generation of the crisis ending. The Gateway of the Sun is still standing at Tiwanaku. The person depicted on it, the staff god, a figure holding two staffs, with a face surrounded by 48 rays, appears in the iconography of cultures across the Andes, from Ecuador to Chile. Nobody has identified what this figure represents. Nobody has read a Tiwanaku text, because Tiwanaku left no writing system. For 700 years, the dominant civilization of South America communicated in a language that left no decipherable record. Number 7. The Akkadian Empire. In 1993, Harvey Weiss, professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at Yale University, published a paper in the journal Science titled The Genesis and Collapse of Third Millennium North Mesopotamian Civilization. Weiss and his team had been excavating Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, the site of the ancient city of Shekna. In the soil beneath the city, they found a 3.5-meter layer of windblown sediment, fine dust with no pottery, no organic material, no human activity of any kind. Above it, a reoccupied city. Below it, a thriving metropolis. The gap represented approximately 300 years of total abandonment. The Akkadian Empire was the first empire in human history. Founded around 2334 BCE by Sargon of Akkad, a man who rose from obscurity to conquer all of Mesopotamia within a single lifetime. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. It administered a population of roughly 1 million people through a centralized bureaucracy, conducted military campaigns in Anatolia and the Levant, and created the first known postal system for administrative correspondence. Sargon's granddaughter, Enheduanna, was the world's first known named author. At its peak, the Akkadian Empire was the most administratively sophisticated state that had ever existed. Around 2154 BCE, it was gone. Weiss's sediment layer told part of the story. The 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of severe drought and aridification lasting approximately 200 years, identified in Marine cores from the Gulf of Oman by Peter Domenical of Columbia University, and in lake sediment records from Iran and the Levant, struck the entire Fertile Crescent simultaneously. Crop failures, population displacement, and the collapse of the agricultural surplus that sustained the empire's administrative infrastructure followed. The scale is almost incomprehensible. The city of Shekna went from an estimated population of 10,000 to 0 in fewer than 10 years. Not gradually, not over a generation. In a decade, the largest city in northern Mesopotamia was empty. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The 4.2 kiloyear event has been documented across North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. It coincides with the collapse not just of Akkad, but of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the early Bronze Age civilizations of the Levant, and the Liangzhu culture in China. The same climate disruption at the same time on 3 continents. The Akkadian Empire fell because it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The wrong place was the center of the most agricultural land on Earth. The wrong time was a 200-year drought that the empire had no framework for anticipating. Here is what makes this particularly unsettling. The 4.2 kiloyear event was identified in the climate record only because researchers knew what to look for. The event itself, a multi-decade disruption of the Indian Ocean monsoon system, reducing rainfall across a band stretching from West Africa to the Himalayas, was triggered by a still-debated forcing mechanism. Not volcanic, not solar, not orbital. The mechanism that produced the worst drought in 4,000 years, the drought that ended the first empire in history, has not been conclusively identified. The Tel Leilan sediment layer is still there. 3.5 meters of empty time, sitting under a Syrian city that no longer exists for different reasons entirely. Number 6, the Bronze Age collapse. There is a letter that was never delivered. It was written in the late 13th century BCE, found at the site of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, still inside the kiln where it was being fired when the city was destroyed. The letter is from the king of Alashia, Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit. It reads, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done terrible things to my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca?" My country is abandoned to itself. 6 ships of the enemy have come and done much damage. The king of Ugarit never read it. The city was destroyed before the letter could be delivered. Within 50 years of that unread letter, the following civilizations ceased to exist: the Mycenaean Greek palace states, the Hittite Empire, the dominant military power of the Near East, the city of Ugarit, the Kassite dynasty of Babylon, the Cypriot palace economies, and the majority of the Levantine city-states. The Bronze Age ended. The Iron Age that followed was not born from innovation. It was born from necessity. The trade networks required to produce bronze, connecting Cypriot copper mines, Afghan tin deposits, and Levantine smelting centers, had collapsed so completely that craftsmen shifted to iron because iron ore could be sourced locally. Eric Klein of George Washington University, in his 2014 book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, estimated that this interconnected system, trade routes stretching from Afghanistan to Britain, administrative correspondence between Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus, and the Aegean, represented the world's first truly globalized economy. It collapsed within a single human lifetime. The human cost was staggering. In Greece, the palace economies of Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Knossos, which had maintained literacy rates, produced administrative records in Linear B script, and coordinated labor across the Aegean, vanished. For the next 400 years, literacy in Greece dropped to near zero. The Greek Dark Ages. The people living in Greece between 1100 and 700 BCE could not read the records left by their predecessors. They had forgotten how. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The Sea Peoples, groups of migrants and raiders who appear in Egyptian records attacking the coast of the Levant, have long been blamed for the collapse. But Eric Klein and others have argued persuasively that the Sea Peoples appear in destruction layers as both perpetrators and victims. They were collapsing too. A simultaneous drought, internal rebellions, earthquake activity in the Aegean, and the disruption of trade systems created a cascade failure across the entire Mediterranean. Pull one thread and the whole fabric unraveled. What makes this particularly disturbing is the speed, not decades, not a century, one lifetime. The most sophisticated network of interacting civilizations the ancient world had ever produced. Civilizations that wrote each other letters, exchanged ambassadors, traded in luxury goods across 4,000 kilometers, and maintained diplomatic protocols more complex than many modern nations. Dissolved within 50 years, and for 400 years afterward, the people living in its ruins could not explain what they had lost, because they could no longer read the records it had left. Number 5. The Classic Maya. In 1839, American diplomat John Lloyd Stevens and British artist Frederick Catherwood hacked through jungle in present-day Honduras and found a city. Pyramids rising above the canopy. Carved stelae covered in hieroglyphic text. Plazas and ball courts and corbelled arches. The city was called Copan, and nobody living in the region at the time knew it had existed. The classic Maya civilization, at its peak between 250 and 800 CE, supported an estimated 10 to 15 million people across more than 40 major cities in the lowlands of present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Tikal, in northern Guatemala, had a population of 60,000 to 90,000 at its peak. Caracol, in Belize, may have held 120,000. These were not village societies. They were urban centers with monumental architecture, sophisticated calendrical systems, a fully decipherable writing system that recorded historical events across centuries, and an agricultural infrastructure, raised fields and terracing, that sustained populations comparable to medieval European cities. Between 800 and 900 CE, the southern Maya lowlands lost an estimated 90% of their population. Not over centuries, in 100 years. Douglas Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, in a 2012 paper in Science, analyzed stalagmite growth records from Belize that preserved a 2,000-year precipitation history. The data showed a series of prolonged droughts beginning in the 9th century CE, corresponding precisely with the abandonment sequence of major southern Maya cities. Copan was abandoned around 820 CE, Quirigua by 810, Palenque around 800. Tikal, the largest city in the Maya world, was functionally empty by 900 CE. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The northern Maya, the cities of Chichen Itza and Uxmal in the Yucatan Peninsula, survived. They did not merely survive, they thrived during the 9th and 10th centuries, absorbing population and trade that had previously flowed through the south. The same climate system, the same cultural framework, the same monsoon patterns. Southern Maya collapsed, northern Maya expanded. No consensus explanation for this divergence exists. Soil depletion, political fragmentation, epidemic disease, and differential drought intensity have all been proposed. The evidence for each is partial. The evidence against each is also partial. The Maya writing system, the only fully decipherable writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, recorded the reigns of rulers, military victories, astronomical observations, and dynastic genealogies across 1,000 years of history. It recorded everything except what was coming. The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in 869 CE. The last monument in the entire southern lowland region was erected at Tonina in 909 CE. After that, silence. Whatever collapsed the southern Maya was specific enough to kill 40 cities in one region, while leaving the cities 300 kilometers to the north untouched. It was fast enough to empty Tikal in a single century. And it was thorough enough that 1,000 years later, the jungle had so completely reclaimed the cities that a diplomat with a machete in 1839 could walk through the ruins of a 90,000-person city and have no idea anyone had ever been there. Number 4, the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon. In November 1888, two Colorado ranchers, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason, were searching for stray cattle in the mesa country of southwestern Colorado when they looked across a canyon and saw a building. Not ruins, a building. Hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, built into a shallow cave in a sheer cliff face, with intact walls and preserved wooden roof beams. They had found Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America. It had been abandoned for approximately 600 years. There were no bodies, no valuables. The inhabitants had left and not come back. The civilization that built Cliff Palace was centered 170 kilometers to the south, at Chaco Canyon in present-day New Mexico. Between 900 and 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon was the administrative and ceremonial center of the most complex society in pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico. Its great houses, Pueblo Bonito, Chetrocatl, Pueblo del Arroyo, were buildings of 4 to 5 stories containing hundreds of rooms, constructed with precision masonry from sandstone quarried kilometers away. Pueblo Bonito alone contained over 650 rooms and 40 kivas, underground ceremonial chambers. Its walls were aligned to within a fraction of a degree to the cardinal directions. The road network that connected Chaco to outlying communities covered an estimated 650 miles. The roads were perfectly straight, not following terrain, but cutting through it, with ramps and staircases where the grade required. They averaged 9 meters in width, wider than most modern 2-lane highways, and were cut directly into bare rock. They were built with no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, and no surveying instruments that have been identified. Jeffrey Dean of the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research identified a prolonged drought in the Four Corners region beginning around 1130 CE, precisely when Chaco Canyon began to be abandoned. By 1150 CE, the great houses were empty. By 1300 CE, the entire Four Corners region, every major ancestral Puebloan site, including Cliff Palace, was depopulated. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Drought explains why people might leave an area. It does not explain the roads. The roads extend in straight lines for miles through terrain that required significant engineering to cross. They connect Chaco to 150 outlying communities across a region the size of Ireland. Nobody has identified what traveled on these roads. No wheel ruts, no evidence of heavy transport. The roads were built with extraordinary effort and then, at some point before the abandonment, simply stopped being used. They are still visible from the air today. It also doesn't explain the deliberate decommissioning. Sites across the Four Corners region show evidence of systematic closure before abandonment. Roofs removed, floors swept clean, doorways sealed. The people who left Chaco and Cliff Palace did not flee. They prepared to leave and then left. Some sites show evidence of burning, but it appears controlled. Specific structures destroyed while adjacent ones were preserved. 50,000 people disappeared from the Four Corners region between 1150 and 1300 CE. The modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona are their descendants. They have oral traditions about Chaco Canyon. Those traditions are not shared publicly in full with outsiders. What has been shared describes Chaco as a place of great power that was intentionally left behind because of what that power had become. The roads are still there, perfectly straight, still going to places that have been empty for 700 years. Number 3, the Indus Valley Civilization. In 1922, archaeologist Rakhal Das Banerjee, excavating for the Archaeological Survey of India at a site called Mohenjo-Daro in present-day Pakistan, realized he was not looking at a single site. He was looking at an entire civilization that nobody had known existed. The streets were laid out in a precise grid oriented to the cardinal directions, with main avenues 9 to 10 meters wide. The bricks were standardized, the same dimensions, the same proportions, used at every site across the civilization's range. The sewage system ran beneath the streets with drains covered by fitted stone slabs and inspection chambers at regular intervals. Individual homes had private bathrooms connected to the city's sewage network. This level of urban sanitation infrastructure would not be matched in the Western world until the 19th century CE, 3,700 years later. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, flourished between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE across a territory stretching from Afghanistan in the northwest to the Arabian Sea coast in the south, covering an area of roughly 1.25 million square kilometers. That is larger than the territories of Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. At its peak, the civilization supported an estimated 5 million people across more than 1,000 settlements. The two major cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each housed an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 people. It was, by population and territorial extent, the largest civilization on Earth in 2500 BCE. Around 1900 BCE, it was gone. Jonathan Mark Canoyer of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who has excavated at Harappa since 1986, documented the collapse in his 1998 book, Ancient Cities of the Indus Valley Civilization. There is no evidence of conquest, no burned palaces, no destroyed granaries, no mass graves from military assault. The skeletal evidence of massacre at Mohenjo-Daro, used for decades to support an Aryan invasion hypothesis, has been radiocarbon dated to centuries after the major population centers were already abandoned. The people of the Indus Valley did not die in war. They left. In 2016, Liviu Gheosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, the ancient Sarasvati of Hindu texts, had gradually shifted its course and reduced its flow over centuries, drying up settlements along its banks. Climate-driven migration, east and south toward the Ganges Plain in peninsular India, may explain the population dispersal. What it does not explain is the silence. The Indus script, 4,000 inscriptions found across hundreds of sites, using 400 to 600 distinct signs, has never been deciphered. Not for lack of trying. Asko Parpola of the University of Helsinki has spent 50 years attempting it. Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel argued in 2004 that the Indus script is not a writing system at all. Too few signs on each object, too little contextual repetition. The debate continues. No consensus has been reached. The truly disturbing aspect isn't the collapse. It's the arithmetic of what was lost. The largest civilization on Earth in 2500 BCE, spanning 1.25 million square kilometers, built cities with indoor plumbing, standardized weights and measures, and a symbolic communication system that covered every corner of its territory, and left no text that any living person has ever read. Not a name, not a king, not a prayer, not a complaint, not a word. Whatever the people of Mohenjo-Daro thought about their world, their cities, their gods, or the slow emptying of the rivers that fed them, we have no access to it. The largest civilization of the ancient world is, to us, completely mute. Number 2, the Vinča culture. In 1908, Serbian archaeologist Miloje Vasic began excavating a large mound 14 kilometers from the center of Belgrade, near the village of Vinča. What he found would take decades to fully understand, would eventually force a recalibration of the entire timeline of European civilization and would ultimately be treated as an anomaly that mainstream archaeology has never fully incorporated into its framework. The Vinca culture flourished between approximately 5,700 and 4,500 BCE across a region covering modern Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, an area of roughly 350,000 square kilometers. At its peak around 5000 BCE, Vinca settlements included towns of 2,500 to 3,500 people, with planned streets and multi-room houses, larger than any contemporary settlement in the Near East. The Vinca culture was not a village society. It was an urban culture 2,000 years before Sumer. They smelted copper, not just cold-hammered native copper, smelted ore. The earliest evidence of pyrotechnic metallurgy in Europe, from sites at Belovod and Plochnik in Serbia, has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 5000 BCE. This is 1,500 years earlier than the conventional beginning of the European Copper Age, and 2,000 years before the Bronze Age began anywhere in Europe. Across hundreds of Vinca sites on pottery, figurines, and clay tablets appears a set of incised marks now known as the Vinca symbols. The symbol set contains approximately 210 distinct signs, used consistently across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers across a period of more than 1,000 years. Harold Harmon, former vice president of the Institute of Archaeomythology and author of Mysteries of the Alphabet, classified the Vinca symbols as the earliest writing in the world in 2008, predating Sumerian cuneiform by 2,000 years. The mainstream consensus in archaeology classifies them as symbolic marks, not a writing system. The debate has never been resolved. Around 4,500 BCE, the Vinca culture collapsed. The standard explanation combines climate deterioration, soil exhaustion after centuries of intensive agriculture, and possible conflict with incoming steppe populations. The evidence for each factor is partial, but here's where the standard explanation becomes genuinely disturbing. The Vinca culture was 14 kilometers from what is now a European capital city. It sat in a densely inhabited region of southeastern Europe, in soil that European farmers had been working for centuries. It was not discovered until 1908, not because it was hidden or remote, but because nobody was looking. The tell at Vinca was simply a mound that the locals knew as the hill. If a culture that built multi-story towns, smelted copper ore, and created a symbolic communication system used consistently across 350,000 square kilometers for 1,200 years, went undetected until 1908, sitting 14 kilometers from a modern capital, the question is not what else exists. The question is how much of it we have already destroyed. The 210 Vinca symbols have been found at sites across southeastern Europe. They appear on objects dating across a span of more than 1,200 years. For a symbolic system to remain consistent across that time frame and geographic range requires a level of cultural coordination that nobody has fully explained. The people who created it disappeared around 4,500 BCE. The symbols are still unread. Whatever they were trying to communicate has been waiting 6,500 years for someone to understand it. Number 1. The builders of Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Savak Yildiz was tending his flock on a limestone ridge in the Taurus Mountains of southeastern Turkey, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa, when he noticed something in the soil, the flat top of a large stone, worked by human hands. He reported it to the local museum. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived the following year, walked across the site, and within minutes said, "In a minute, everything is clear. This is the find of the century." What Schmidt had found was Göbekli Tepe, built approximately 9,600 BCE, 11,600 years ago. The T-shaped limestone pillars rise up to 5.5 meters in height and weigh up to 20 tons each. They are carved with images of foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, cranes, and abstract symbols in high relief. They stand in circular enclosures arranged so that the T-shapes face a central pair of larger pillars, up to 5.5 meters tall and estimated at 20 tons each. The carving is precise, the symbolism consistent across enclosures, the construction uniform in technique. Geophysical surveys of the site have identified at least 20 enclosures still buried. As of Klaus Schmidt's death in 2014, fewer than 5% of the site had been excavated. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by 6,600 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,100 years. It predates the domestication of wheat, which occurred in the same region of southeastern Turkey, by approximately 1,000 years. The people who built it had no pottery, no domesticated animals, no metal tools, no writing system we have identified. They were hunter-gatherers, mobile groups dependent on wild game and foraged plant foods. And they quarried, transported, shaped, and erected 20-ton limestone pillars with a precision that modern engineers, examining the carvings and alignments, have described as difficult to replicate with contemporary tools. The organizational complexity required is staggering. Feeding, coordinating, and directing a workforce large enough to quarry and move 20-ton stones over distances of hundreds of meters, maintaining the site for an estimated 1,000 years across generations, requires a social structure and communication system beyond anything attributed to mobile hunter-gatherer groups. The standard archaeological model has no framework for it. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was deliberately buried. Around 8,000 BCE, after approximately 1,600 years of use, the builders filled every excavated enclosure with rubble, flint tools, animal bones, and compacted soil. The infill was thorough. Complete, it covered the tops of the pillars. The site was sealed. The scale of labor required to bury Göbekli Tepe has been estimated by Schmidt and his team as exceeding the labor required to build it. They built something for 1,600 years. Then they buried it. No satisfying explanation. For the burial has been produced, not the abandonment of the site, not the collapse of the culture that used it. A deliberate, organized, labor-intensive effort to cover and seal the most significant structure they had ever built. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what was buried. It's who buried it. We have no name for these people. The civilization, if that word applies, that constructed the world's oldest monumental architecture, maintained it across 1,600 years and dozens of generations, and then sealed it with deliberate precision, has left no confirmed descendants, no identified language, and no legacy that archaeology can trace forward in time. They appear in the record, and then they do not. In 2017, a team led by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis at the University of Edinburgh proposed in a paper in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry that one of Göbekli Tepe's pillars, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, depicts a comet impact event corresponding to the Younger Dryas onset, approximately 12,900 years ago. If correct, the builders were not simply constructing a temple. They were recording a catastrophe that by the time they built Göbekli Tepe in 9,600 BCE had occurred 3,300 years earlier. They remembered it. They carved it into stone. They built an enclosure around the carving and maintained it for 1,600 years. Then they buried it. The question is not what they built. 95% of the site is still underground. The question is not even why they buried it, though that question has no answer. The question is who they expected to find it. They buried it in a way that preserved it for 11,600 years. The pillars are intact. The carvings are intact. The site survived because it was sealed. Whatever they were trying to say to whoever they expected to come after them, they built it to last. We found it in 1994. We have read almost none of it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.